shy. The meat stand. The shocking case in the countryside. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Have you ever wondered how an ordinary town, tucked away in the quiet hills of Virginia, could be shaken to its core by one man's darkness, yet rise again through courage, faith, and community? Tonight, we walk through the haunting shadows of Devil's Hollow and the strength of the people who refuse to bow to fear. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of resilience and the lessons hidden in tragedy, I invite you to join our community here. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story with someone who values the strength of human spirit. Together, we'll continue uncovering stories that remind us not just of the darkness in the world, but of the light that always fights back. On the first Saturday morning of July, 2023, the farmers' market in Strasburg, Virginia was alive in the way it always was during the summer rows of stalls, with ripe peaches stacked in baskets, the smell of fresh bread still warm from a neighbor's oven, children tugging on their mother's arms, begging for kettle corn, and the slow, steady hum of conversation from people who had known each other for decades. It was the kind of place that reminded folks why they loved the Shenandoah Valley. Simple, safe, and predictable. But that morning would burn itself into the town's memory forever, because inside that comfort, something appeared that no one was prepared to see. At a stall on the east end of the market, where a butcher named Tommy Finch sold discounted cuts of meat from a wooden counter, a middle-aged woman leaned in to inspect a slab that seemed oddly pale under the sunlight. At first, she thought it was pork. Nothing unusual, just another cheap find from Tommy's stall, which was always busy with people looking to stretch their grocery dollar. But when she tilted her head and the early rays cut across the surface, she froze. The texture was wrong too soft, the fat layered strangely, the skin uneven in a way that set off an instinct she didn't want to name. She whispered, almost to herself, "Why does this look like human flesh?" Before she could turn away, a young man standing nearby bent closer, curiosity getting the better of him, his face drained of color. He pointed with a trembling hand, his voice breaking into a hoarse shout that shattered the calm of the market. "That's a finger. That's a human hand." In an instant, chaos erupted. Mothers pulled their children close, baskets were dropped and rolled across the gravel, and people bolted in every direction, knocking over produce and colliding in panic as though fire had swept through the stalls. The smell of raw meat, suddenly unbearable, seemed to hang over everything like a suffocating cloud. Tommy Finch, the man behind the counter, stood stiff and sweating, his face as white as a sheet, unable to move as the crowd turned their fear into fury, pointing, shouting, gagging in disgust. Some people cried openly. Others covered their mouths and wretched, stumbling backward to get away from the stall that had, in the space of a heartbeat, become something out of a nightmare. Within minutes, the story spread beyond the market, carried in frantic phone calls and gasps across kitchen tables. Someone had been selling human meat in the heart of their quiet little town. By the time deputies from the Shenandoah County Sheriff's Office arrived to string up yellow tape and push the terrified crowd back, Strasburg had already changed. What had once been a summer morning like any other was now the beginning of a story that no one in the valley would ever forget. A story that would pull neighbors into suspicion, drag hidden fears into daylight, and test the very idea of what it meant to live in a safe community. And though no one knew it yet, the bloody trail from that butcher's stall stretched far beyond the market, leading into the dark ridges of Massanutten Mountain and into the secrets of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. The deputies who arrived at the market that morning were used to small-town quarrels and the occasional drunk at a bar, not the kind of horror that now sat covered under a plastic sheet on a butcher's counter. Yellow tape went up quickly, hemming in the chaos, though it could not silence the murmurs or stop the crowd from pressing forward. Captain Daniel Hart, a tall man with gray at his temples and a steady, battle-worn expression, stepped from his cruiser and scanned the faces in front of him. He had served the valley for decades, and he knew what he was seeing was more than fear. This was the look of a town that felt betrayed, as though safety itself had been stolen from them. Hart crouched near the stall while the forensic team peeled back a corner of the tarp. The sight made his jaw tighten. A severed hand, fingernails still visible, one painted with chipped red polish there, was no denying what it was. He straightened slowly, nodded to his team, and turned toward the man everyone already saw as guilty. Tommy Finch stood cuffed by a deputy's cruiser, sweat darkening his shirt, his face pale as ash. "I didn't know," he muttered hoarsely. "I swear I didn't know." Hart approached, his shadow falling over Tommy. "Then help me understand," he said evenly. "Where did you get it?" Tommy swallowed, his words stumbling out. "I sell meat, that's all. I buy from hunters, trappers, anyone who has extra. A man came to me a few times, called himself Quinn. He said he had wild hog, maybe even bear, and it was cheap. He'd meet me out past Fort Valley Road, just at the edge of the forest, always at night. He brought bags, I paid cash, that's all." Hart's eyes narrowed. "And you never noticed the weight, the shape of what you carried?" Tommy's lips trembled. One time, I thought I heard something, a noise, like a groan. He shoved extra bills in my hand and told me not to open it until I was home. I thought maybe it was stolen livestock. I told myself not to ask. I didn't think." His voice broke, and he looked away. Behind the tape, the crowd erupted. A woman's voice rose sharp above the others. "You could have fed that to our families," another shouted. "Our kids ate from your stall." Anger flared hotter than fear, and deputies had to spread their arms, holding back neighbors who only hours earlier had greeted Tommy with handshakes. Hart knew there was no salvaging Tommy's reputation here, guilty or not. Trust had been shattered. Lieutenant Sarah Monroe arrived, her stride brisk, her expression hard as she took in the scene. She was younger than Hart, sharp-eyed, unflinching, and she wasted no time. "He's either complicit or he's our only thread to whoever island. Either way, he comes with us." Hart nodded, and with a simple hand signal, Tommy was led to the back of a patrol car. His pleas carried across the lot, high and desperate. "I didn't know! I didn't know!" But the crowd turned away, faces twisted with disgust, no one willing to believe him. Hart watched as the evidence bags were sealed, the severed hand inside looking almost accusatory, as though pointing back at everyone who had ignored the disappearances these past months. He felt the weight of it settling over the town, a weight that would not lift quickly. By the time the sun dipped lower that day, news had already spread beyond Strasburg. Houses along the valley roads locked their doors early, and mothers pulled their children inside when the sky turned orange. The market where neighbors once trusted each other had become the origin of a nightmare, and the sense of safety that bound the community together was gone. In kitchens lit only by the blue glow of evening television, families whispered the same chilling question: if human flesh was on a table in broad daylight, what else was waiting for them in the shadows of Massanutten Mountain? Fear spread through Strasburg faster than any storm rolling down from the Blue Ridge, and by the morning after the butcher stall discovery, the town no longer felt like the same place. Along porches on King Street, neighbors spoke in whispers, their eyes drawn again and again toward the dark ridges of Massanutten, as though the forest itself were listening. The Shenandoah Valley had always prided itself on safety, where doors stayed unlocked and children biked past twilight, but overnight every creak of a floorboard seemed menacing. Parents now walked their kids into school, rather than letting them ride the bus. And by the following weekend the farmers' market stood nearly deserted, vendors staring at crates of unsold peaches and tomatoes while the town's families chose to stay home. The empty streets were filled instead with stories. People recalled those who had vanished in recent months. Lynn Carter, the gas station cashier who never returned from a grocery run, a drifter called Dale who used to sleep behind the hardware store, a little boy last seen playing near the creek, and a retired handyman whose sudden absence was shrugged off as him wandering. Alone, each loss had seemed sad but explainable. Together, after the horror on Tommy Finch's table, they formed a single terrifying pattern. At the diner on Holiday Street, men hunched over black coffee and muttered that something evil had rooted itself in the valley. At Sunday service, Pastor Joel Bennett urged his flock to stay calm, yet his voice trembled when he spoke of darkness and faith. Rumors crowded the phone lines at the sheriff's office, reports of headlights deep in the woods, strangers walking lonely roads, footsteps outside barns after midnight. Most of it was fear inventing shapes in the dark, Hart knew, but the chance that one call was real kept him at his desk late into the night. Piled before him were missing persons reports, each folder a story without an ending. Looking over them, Hart felt the weight of truth pressing harder. These weren't isolated tragedies, but pieces of one puzzle, and the market discovery had only revealed the first corner. As the town's routine dissolved, suspicion crept in. Porch lights now burned all night like warnings. Dogs barked at every rustle of leaves. Teenagers who once roamed the riverbanks after dusk were grounded, their parents' nerves pulled taut. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Some whispered that Tommy's family must have known more than they admitted. Others insisted a cult was hiding in the valley, pointing to strange wooden carvings found in the woods years earlier. For Maya Brooks, the reporter at the Shenandoah Valley Times, the fear itself was becoming news. She filled notebook after notebook with stories, trying to separate gossip from fact. But the deeper she dug, the more Quinn Mercer's name lingered at the edges of every whisper. One evening, leaving the newsroom, she sensed eye tease on her. Across the street, beneath a weak lamp, a tall figure stood just long enough for her heart to hammer, then vanished into the shadows. She hurried to her car, fumbling her keys, realizing that by writing about the valley's terror, she might have stepped straight into it. Meanwhile, on Fort Valley Road, Earl Whitaker noticed details others ignored. The retired bus driver had always walked the trails at dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and his old habit of paying attention. For months he had seen tire tracks where no vehicle should be, and once he had come across a groove in the dirt as though a heavy bundle had been dragged. He told himself it was poachers or campers until the market incident forced him to remember. Now he flipped through his worn notebook, jotting times and places with shaking hands, realizing those marks led toward the Massanutten woods, where no one dared wander after dark. In a quiet town, such secrets could stay buried for years, but not anymore. By the end of the week, Strasburg was holding its breath. Families no longer asked whether the nightmare was real, but when it would come again. The sound of gravel crunching on a driveway made hearts race. The knock of wind against a shutter sent prayers rising under hushed voices. Captain Hart, watching the lights burn across the valley from his office window, understood what was at stake. If they did not stop Quinn Mercer soon, Strasburg would not only lose more lives, it would lose itself, consumed from within by fear that no deputy's badge could hold back. The confirmation arrived 3 days after the market horror, and with it the last hope that Strasburg's nightmare might be a mistake vanished. The state lab's report came in the morning. The severed hand matched the DNA of Lynn Carter, the 23-year-old cashier who had vanished in May. When Captain Daniel Hart sat across from her parents inside the sheriff's office, the cries that followed seemed to echo through the entire building. Lynn's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, while her father, trembling, demanded answers no one could give. How could a daughter leave for groceries and come back as nothing more than evidence sealed in a bag? By evening, the valley had already heard the news. Neighbors streamed to the Carter home with food and prayers, but grief hung heavy no matter how many casseroles filled the kitchen table. For the first time in living memory, Strasburg felt less like a town and more like a place under siege. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Flashbulbs popped as Hart stood before them, careful with every word. "The remains discovered at the Strasburg market have been confirmed as human," he said. "We are pursuing this case as a homicide investigation. This department will not rest until justice is done." He said no more, but his measured tone only deepened the dread. The press wanted details, names, theories. Hart gave them none. That night, Maya Brooks tapped out her story at the Shenandoah Valley Times office. Her headline read, "DNA confirms missing woman's death. Town in mourning." She wrote it quickly, but when the presses rolled, she felt hollow. Returning home, she looked not at her notes but at her locked front door, listening for sounds in the street. The shadow she had seen nights earlier refused to leave her mind, and now she understood covering Quinn Mercer's trail meant carrying his gaze with her. Inside the sheriff's office, Hart gathered his team around a wide table marked with pins and maps. Lieutenant Sarah Monroe leaned forward, her voice sharp. "This wasn't the beginning. Mercer's been doing this for months. The stall was simply where we finally saw it. A line of pins traced across the board disappearances, sightings, odd reports all leading toward the dense folds of Massanutten Mountain. Ranger Cole Matthews pointed out old fire roads that cut into the George Washington forest. If Mercer is hauling bodies, he knows these back roads. Some of them aren't even on maps anymore. He could vanish in here and last for weeks. The thought settled over the room like a storm cloud. Hart nodded. Then we go where he goes, into the forest. Across town, Earl Whitaker sat at his kitchen table with a worn atlas spread open. For years, the retired bus driver had walked the trails of Fort Valley at dawn, carrying his thermos of coffee. He remembered tire tracks where there shouldn't have been any, a groove in the dirt like something heavy had been dragged, and an old deer stand that looked freshly used when no hunter had claimed it. He had scribbled these notes quietly, never thinking they mattered, but now he traced them onto his map with shaking hands. The lines he drew all bent toward the same place, the ridges above Elizabeth Furnace. He folded the map and placed it in an envelope, ready to deliver it to Captain Hart in the morning. As he did, he caught movement outside his window, a shadow slipping past the porch rail. Earl snapped the lock shut, something he hadn't done in years, and kept the envelope under his pillow that night. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued, but bent beneath the weight of fear. The elementary school canceled its summer program, citing safety concerns. The baseball field sat empty. The corner pharmacy posted new hours, closing before sunset. At church, Pastor Joel Bennett led prayers for the Carter family, but when he left the pulpit, his eyes lingered on the back pews as though expecting someone to be missing. Strasburg was changing, its pulse no longer steady but frantic, and everyone knew it. By the end of that week, the valley was no longer wondering if Quinn Mercer was real. He was real, and he was close. The confirmation of Lynn Carter's death had done more than end hope. It had drawn a line across the town's history. On one side stood the quiet life they once believed in. On the other, the shadowed woods where a predator waited. And as the July sun sank behind the mountains, every porch light along the valley flicked on, as if the whole town were trying to hold back the dark. Tommy Finch sat in the interrogation room, his wrists shackled to the metal table, sweat soaking through his shirt, though the air conditioner rattled overhead. Captain Daniel Hart and Lieutenant Sarah Monroe stepped inside, their expressions carved from stone. Hart sat, folding his hands, voice measured but sharp. "Tommy, this is your last chance to come clean. You may not be a killer, but you handled something no man should ever handle. You can carry that guilt, or you can help us stop the one who put you here." Tommy's lips trembled, his gaze darting toward the camera in the corner as though searching for a way out. "I didn't kill her," he whispered. "I swear I didn't. I bought from a man called himself Quinn. He always met me past Fort Valley Road, right where the sawmill trail cuts off. Always at night. Heavy bags, cash only. Said it was hog, sometimes bear. I didn't ask." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes unblinking. "And you never once saw the truth? Not a finger? Not the smell?" Tommy's voice cracked. "One time he looked at me, right in the eyes, and said, 'Don't open it, if you value your life.' His eyes cold, like he wasn't even human. That was enough. I never looked again." Hart tapped the table, letting the silence stretch. "Then you know what this means. If you were threatened into silence, Quinn isn't just moving bodies. He's moving victims who may still be breathing." Sarah's throat tightened at the thought. Alive, somewhere in the dark ridges. She pressed harder. Where exactly? Tommy described the dirt pull-off, the headlights flashing twice, the raincoat Quinn never took off no matter the weather. Hart jotted the details, his pulse steady but his jaw set. He had hunted killers before, but never one who treated people as cargo. "You'll stay here," Hart said flatly. "If you're telling the truth, this is your only way out." As they stepped into the hallway, deputies straightened, sensing the shift. Word of Tommy's confession swept through the department, heavy as a storm front. That evening, the briefing room brimmed with maps and murmurs. Ranger Cole Matthews traced a finger across a faded fire road. He could get in and out without a soul seeing. If Mercer knows these cuts, he could hide for weeks. Sarah's voice was iron. "Then that's where we start. If there's even a chance someone's alive, we don't wait." Across town, grief wore a new face. Instead of collapsing in their kitchen, the Carters opened their yard to neighbors who lit candles in silence. Dozens gathered, their flames trembling in the summer breeze, casting Lynn's framed photograph in a halo of gold. No one spoke, but the silence said everything. They wanted Quinn Mercer found, and they wanted him stopped. Earl Whitaker, watching the vigil on local television, folded the map he had marked the night before. At dawn, he climbed into his pickup and drove straight to the sheriff's office. When Hart unsealed the envelope, inside lay a hand-drawn chart of trails, tire tracks, and odd disturbances dating back months. Earl pointed to the ridges above Elizabeth Furnace. "He's been using this cut. I've walked it. You'll find something there." For the first time in weeks, Hart felt the town itself stepping into the fight. Maya Brooks, meanwhile, opened her laptop to draft another story when her inbox chimed. A message, with no subject line, no sender she recognized, waited. 4 words glowed against the screen. "Stop digging. You're next." Her hands froze above the keys, heart pounding. She shut the laptop, every instinct telling her she had been marked. By sunrise, sheriff's cruisers lined the lot, rifles checked, radios tested. The pull-off Tommy described was circled in red on every map. Strasburg had once been a valley of orchards and quiet nights. Now it was a hunting ground. And the question wasn't whether they would catch Quinn Mercer, it was how many nights the town could endure before they did. The operation began before dawn, tension hanging in the sheriff's office like the heavy fog that clung to the valley. Captain Hart stood before the wall-sized map of Massanutten Mountain, red circles marking the dirt pull-off, the fire road, and the ridges Earl Whitaker had traced. Deputies tightened vests, checked rifles, and listened as Lieutenant Sarah Monroe laid out the plan. 2 units flanking north and south, Hart's team pushing through the Sawmill Road with Ranger Cole guiding. "If Mercer's out here, he knows the land better than any of us," Hart said. "He's counting on us to stumble. We don't give him that." By sunrise, 3 trucks rolled toward the foothills, leaving Strasburg hushed in their wake. At the pull-off, the dogs lunged forward, pulling handlers into the trees. Within minutes, the forest closed around them, its canopy muting sound, its air damp and metallic. The silence was broken only by the dogs' sharp barks when they struck fresh scent. Near a shallow ditch, deputies uncovered disturbed soil. As shovels cut through the earth, the odor rose first, thick and nauseating. Then came the sight of bones, clothing rotted into rags. A deputy muttered a prayer as Hart ordered the site marked and sealed. They moved on, faster now, dread propelling them. Hours deeper, the team stumbled across a false leaden abandoned campsite, littered with empty cans and a torn sleeping bag. For a moment it seemed Mercer had been there, but Cole shook his head. "Too old. He's close, but not here." The letdown only sharpened their nerves. Then came the sound, thin, hoarse, almost lost to the wind. "Help, please." Hart froze, lifted a hand for silence. The voice came again, weak but real. Deputies tore through brush until they found a crude pit covered in branches. Beneath lay a young woman, bound and bruised, eyes wide with terror. Sarah cut the ropes, whispering reassurance. When the girl's cracked lips moved, the words chilled them. "He carved marks on the wall," said when the moon rose. "I was next." She was carried back to safety, medics rushing her toward the trucks, but her warning left a shadow heavier than any wound. Mercer planned his killings like a timetable, each victim a step toward something larger. Pressing on, the forest opened into a clearing where a shack sagged under moss and rot. Inside, the air was rank with decay. Hooks hung from beams, rusted blades scattered the table, but it was the walls that froze Sarah's breath. Symbols had been carved into the wood-crude crosses, circles intersected by knives, spirals etched deep as if by obsession. In the corner, a stained journal lay open. Its pages held not just names and dates, but sketches faces of victims, drawn in jagged hand, each one crossed out except the last. Beneath the sketch, scrawled in dark ink, were 3 words, "The Ninth Soul." Hart closed the book, his jaw set. Outside, the forest pressed in, every rustle of leaves carrying the threat of eyes watching. Mercer was not a man who killed in anger. He was a predator writing his own scripture. They had pulled one girl from his grasp, but the journal told them clearly he was already preparing the next ritual. And as Hart stared across the clearing, he felt the woods change around him. This wasn't wilderness anymore. This was a board, a game set by Mercer's hand, and every move they made he had already planned one step ahead. Night fell heavy over the valley, rain swelling in the clouds, when Captain Hart convened his task force in the dim conference room. On the table lay the journal from the shack, its pages damp, smeared, more unsettling the longer one looked. Lieutenant Sarah Monroe flipped it open, not to the sketches they had already studied, but to the back cover where new markings had been found, circles overlapping with crude drawings of a crescent moon, a date scrawled beneath in jagged ink. "He's not just counting," she said, her voice taut. "He's timing it. This isn't random, it's set to the moon." Ranger Cole Matthews nodded grimly. "There's a clearing called Devil's Hollow. Locals whisper about Itmen went missing there during the war, never found. The tree line forms a circle. If Mercer's planning a ritual, that's where he'll do it." At the far end of the table, Earl Whitaker leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his folded map. "I've walked Devil's Hollow. Folks say you can hear voices in the wind there. I never stayed long enough to find out. But if Mercer wants the valley to feel his work, that's the stage he'll choose." The room was heavy with silence. Hart looked from the journal to the map. "Then we set the trap there. Not tomorrow, not after the fact. We wait for him where he believes he holds power." As deputies murmured and began sketching plans, Maya Brooks sat with her notebook open but her mind elsewhere. Hours earlier, she had found a small, padded envelope on her porch. Inside was a strip of fabric, damp, caked with mud, and smelling faintly metallic. Tucked with it was a scrap of paper. "Your story ends in the hollow." Now, listening to Hart outline the operation, her stomach turned cold. Mercer knew her name, her address. He wasn't just threatening, he was inviting her in. Sarah noticed her pale expression and leaned close. "You should step back," she said, her tone softer than usual. "He's circling you. That package proves it." Maya shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I back off, people only have rumors. If he wants me afraid, I won't give him that." Sarah studied her a moment, then gave the smallest nod. The meeting wound down with assignments. Snipers along the ridge, drones overhead if the storm broke, entry teams staged at both ends of the hollow. Hart's final words were steady but grave. "We end this before he claims a ninth life. We bring him out, one way or another." When the deputies dispersed, Hart lingered at the courthouse window. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in stark white. For an instant he swore he saw headlights glint far out by the tree line, gone before the thunder rolled. He clenched his jaw, certain Mercer was already watching, already savoring the hunt. And as the rain began to pound the roof, Hart swore not another soul would be crossed off in Mercer's book knot while he still drew breath. By the time dawn broke after the storm, Strasburg no longer felt like the same valley it had once been. Word of Devil's Hollow had spread beyond any official channels, whispered in the grocery aisles, over gas pumps, and in pews on Sunday morning. Parents kept children inside, shops bolted their doors early, and by nightfall the town square sat empty, its benches slick with rain, street lamps glowing to no one. Rumors grew teeth. Mercer standing at the edge of fields, dogs howling until they fell silent, strange markings appearing on barns overnight. Pastor Joel Bennett urged prayer, but even his congregation thinned, people slipping out before hymns ended. The Carter home no longer hosted vigils of candles on the lawn. Instead, the town gathered in the church basement, rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors clutching each other's hands, the air so thick with fear it smelled like sweat and wax. Lynn's brother stood near the back, a baseball bat propped at his side, glaring at the door as if expecting Mercer to walk in. Deputies stood guard outside, but even they shifted uneasily under the humming fluorescent lights. Across town, Maya Brooks wrote late into the night. Her article headlined, "Town Holds Breath as Hunt for Ninth Soul Nears." This time, though, she didn't just receive clicks, received replies. Among them was one message that stopped her cold. "I saw him years ago in West Virginia. Hood, raincoat, eyes like coals. Thought I imagined it until I read your words." Maya printed the email, folded it into her notebook, and sat staring at her darkened window for hours, convinced Mercer's reach stretched farther than Strasburg. Earl Whitaker, who had once walked the ridges at sunrise, now spent his mornings at the diner, a map spread across the table. Young men gathered around him, listening as he jabbed a finger at trails and fire roads. "Don't wander here," he told them. "Don't cut through there. He knows those woods better than you know your own yard." Some laughed nervously, but others nodded. the authority in Earl's voice a rare anchor in a time when law and rumor blurred. Still, even Earl's maps couldn't keep families from leaving. Pickup trucks loaded with mattresses and boxes rolled down Route 11, taillights shrinking into the night. Houses darkened, lawns grew ragged in days, and the sound of moving vans replaced the usual chorus of crickets. Strasburg wasn't just frightened, it was hollowing out, piece by piece. Captain Hart saw it every evening when he drove the streets, patrol lights glinting off shuttered storefronts. One night, he slowed before a row of houses already abandoned, curtains fluttering in broken windows, swing sets rusting in yards where children no longer played. It hit him then. If Mercer wasn't stopped, Strasburg wouldn't just be haunted, it would vanish, a dot on the map erased by fear. Back at the courthouse, Hart stood over the journal again, tracing the symbols with a calloused finger, listening to the rain tap against the glass. Outside, the few who remained lit candles in the square, their faces pale but unyielding. They weren't praying for comfort anymore, they were demanding deliverance. Hart watched their flames flicker in the storm wind, and knew Mercer had already taken too much. But as long as the town had breath, the fight wasn't over. The valley hadn't given itself up yet. And neither would he. Captain Hart gathered his team in the courthouse basement, the storm still dripping through the gutters above, the air damp with stone and fear. On the table lay maps and the battered journal, pages smeared with symbols that looked less like words and more like wounds. Lieutenant Sarah Monroe turned the book to a fresh discovery, an entire page, covered with the drawing of a crescent moon, a knife driven through its center, the number 9 scrawled beneath in thick strokes. "This isn't just a list," she said. "It's a countdown. He means to strike when the moon is high. He wants a stage." Ranger Cole Matthews traced the map with a steady hand. "Devil's Hollow is the only ground that fits. Wide sky, ring of tree sits, built like a theater. He'll finish it there." Hart looked around the table, his eyes hard. "Then we take the Hollow from him. Perimeter teams, sharpshooters on the ridge, trackers on every back trail. He thinks he controls the valley. We'll show him otherwise." The room was silent until Sarah spoke again, her voice heavier. "The journal doesn't just talk about a ninth soul, it names one, Maya Brooks." Murmurs rippled through the deputies, and Hart's jaw clenched. At the back of the room, Maya froze, the color draining from her face. "He's not guessing," she said quietly. "He sent me a package this morning. Inside was a newspaper clipping of my own article with my face circled in red." She opened her notebook and laid it on the table. "If you're setting bait, you don't need to pick. He already has." Sarah moved closer, her tone sharp. "If we do this, you won't be alone. You'll be covered from every side." Maya nodded, though her hands shook. "I know, but if he's watching me, then I'm the way to draw him in. Better it happens on your terms than his." Earl Whitaker stepped forward from the corner, rolling his map across the table. "I've walked Devil's Hollow more than most. There are 2 old logging cuts he could use to slip out if things turn. You'll want men posted there, or you'll lose him to the rocks." Hart studied him, then gave a rare nod. "You'll ride with us, Earl, if you're willing." Earl's eyes, weathered and tired, burned with something that hadn't been there in years. "I'm not letting my valley fall to a man like him." That night, Hart visited the Carter home, standing on the porch where a deputy kept watch. Lynn's father rose from his chair, his hands trembling but his eyes clear. "I heard the talk about the Hollow," he said, voice rough. "If that's where he means to make his altar, don't let it be another Carter girl or another soul from this town. End it there." Hart gripped his hand firmly, promising nothing but carrying the weight all the same. As dawn neared, the courthouse hummed with preparation. Rifles were checked, radios crackled, drones warmed on their pads, and maps were marked with red pins. Hart spoke once more before they rolled out. "Mercer wants the Hollow as his stage. He believes the 9th life will seal whatever madness he worships. We'll let him come, and then we'll shut the curtain on him for good." As the trucks rumbled toward the ridges, Maya sat in the back seat of one, her notebook clutched against her chest. She thought of the clipping with her face circled, of the stranger's email from West Virginia claiming Mercer had been seen before. Maybe Strasburg wasn't his first stage, but she prayed it would be his last. Outside the window, the clouds parted, and the moon broke through, silver light spilling across the tree line of Devil's Hollow, like a spotlight waiting for its actor. Hart watched it too from the lead vehicle, jaw tight. It wasn't a vow he carried anymore, it was the certainty that when the moon rose full, so too would the reckoning. The night of the full moon carried a silence so heavy it seemed the forest itself was holding its breath. Captain Hart stood on the ridge above Devil's Hollow, radios crackling softly in his ear as deputies spread through the tree line. Flood lamps were ready, sharpshooters in place, drones circling like restless fireflies overhead. In the clearing below, Maya Brooks stood beneath the massive oak, a wire tucked beneath her shirt, her face pale but steady. "You're not alone." Hart's voice came through the earpiece. "Every path is covered. Just hold your ground." Hours passed, the moon climbing, when the sound came footsteps, slow and deliberate, from the northern trail. A figure emerged. Tall, gaunt, raincoat, glistening though no rain fell, and a mask of carved wood hiding his face, slits glowing red in the moonlight. Quinn Mercer moved like a man stepping into his theater, every gesture rehearsed. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, tilting his head toward Maya. "The ninth soul," he rasped. "You wrote of me. Now you'll complete me." Maya's throat was dry, but she forced her voice to hold. "This isn't scripture, Quinn. It's sickness. They won't remember you as immortal only as broken." His laugh was jagged, echoing across the hollow. "Broken things live forever. Tonight, they'll see." He stepped closer, blade glinting. Hart clenched his fist, holding back the order until Mercer crossed the invisible line. When he did, Hart shouted, and the hollow erupted lights blazed, rifles raised, voices barked commands. Mercer staggered at first, blinded, then moved not back but forward, slashing wildly, driving toward Maya. Shots cracked, dust flying, but he twisted with unnerving speed, cutting across the clearing toward the southern tree line. Deputies surged in, but Mercer slashed one across the arm, sending him sprawling, then bolted toward the rocks. Hart left the ridge, barreling down the slope, his boots tearing earth. Sarah and Cole cut Mercer off near the oak, but he spun, hurling dirt into their faces, then lunged again at Maya, blade raised high. It was then Hart slammed into him, both men crashing hard to the ground. The mask split against stone, revealing Mercer's face pale, eyes wild, lips curled in a snarl. They grappled in the dirt, Mercer stronger than his frame suggested, his blade driving inches from Hart's ribs before Sarah's boot knocked it loose. Deputies piled in, Cole wrenching Mercer's arm until cuffs finally snapped shut. Still, he thrashed, blood dripping from a cut across his temple, laughter bubbling in his throat. "The hollow remembers," he hissed. "Even bound, it will finish what I began." Hart leaned close, breath ragged. "Not tonight. Not here." The deputies dragged Mercer away, his laughter echoing long after. Maya collapsed to her knees, not crying but staring at the shattered mask glinting in the moonlight. She picked it up with trembling hands, feeling its rough edges, the wood still warm. Sarah crouched beside her, steadying her shoulder. "It's over," she said. Maya shook her head faintly. "Number? It's only written down now, and I'll make sure they read the truth." Hart stood in the clearing, chest heaving, watching the silver light gleam across the broken mask and the oak above. Mercer was chained, but the valley's shadow would not lift overnight. Devil's Hollow had its reckoning, but healing would take longer than any single night. The days after Mercer's capture were wrapped in a silence that didn't feel like peace, but like the valley holding its breath, unsure if the nightmare had truly ended. Quinn Mercer sat in a cell beneath the courthouse, wrists shackled, eyes burning with a fever that hadn't dimmed. Deputies rotated on watch, but even seasoned men admitted they disliked the way he stared unblinking, hungry, as if still hunting through bars. He rarely spoke, yet when he did, it was never of remorse. "The Hollow was only one altar," he murmured one night to Lieutenant Sarah Monroe through the glass. "Others will rise. Others already walk." The words chilled her more than his silence. Forensic teams continued digging through the remnants of Mercer's lairs, uncovering not just jars and sketches, but names stretching beyond Virginia. Some belonged to missing persons from West Virginia, Maryland, even Pennsylvania. The valley realized Mercer hadn't been born here. He had only chosen Strasburg as his stage. The sheriff's office became a warehouse of horrors, boxes of evidence stacked to the ceiling. Captain Hart walked the corridors each night, exhaustion etched deep, unwilling to rest until every piece was catalogued. The town itself staggered between relief and unease. Families began unlocking doors, children rode bicycles again, and for the first time in months, the school held a baseball game. The crack of the bat against the ball carried across the valley like an anthem of defiance, neighbors lining the field, clapping awkwardly at first, then louder, freer, until it sounded like joy. Pastor Bennett spoke of resilience on Sundays, urging his flock to live without the shadow. Earl Whitaker, his map finally tucked away, watched the children's game from the bleachers, his weathered hands steady on his knees, as if guarding them simply by being present. In her small office, Maya Brooks sat with the broken mask beside her typewriter, its jagged grin a reminder of what had stalked them. She typed carefully, her words less about Mercer and more about the valley. This was never only the story of a killer, she wrote. It was the story of a town that refused to surrender to him. Evil thrives on fear, but fear did not have the last word here. We did. She named Earl, Lynn's family, the deputies, even the children who dared to play again, weaving their strength into the narrative. Her article reached papers far beyond the Shenandoah. And for once, Strasburg was not just a headline of horror, it was a lesson in endurance. Yet Hart knew shadows did not vanish with an arrest. One evening, he stood on the courthouse steps as federal agents loaded evidence into trucks bound for Washington. Among the crates was Mercer's shattered mask, its edges sealed away, its story unfinished. Sarah joined him, her voice low. "You think he was telling the truth? That others walk?" Hart watched the sun sink, the valley bathed in gold. Maybe, maybe not. But what matters is this valley learned how to stand. That's something no one can steal. Later, as he walked home, Hart passed the schoolyard where children still tossed a ball under the fading light. Their laughter carried on the wind, thin but real, cutting through the long silence that had gripped the valley. For the first time, Hart let himself believe not in vows or in shadows, but in the simple truth of children laughing again, and he knew that was where the valley's healing would begin. Winter settled over Strasburg with a sharpness that seemed to bite deeper than usual, though no one could decide whether it was the wind or the memory of Mercer that stung more. His trial was set for March 2024, and the thought of it hung like a shadow on the calendar. For now, Mercer sat chained in a concrete cell beneath the courthouse, quiet but not still. Deputies reported how he scraped shapes into the metal table with his nail shaft moons, slashes, the same symbols that had once marked barns in West Virginia. He muttered at times, not words of remorse but fragments of ritual, as though the performance had not ended. Captain Hart traveled often to Richmond, pressed by state and federal officials combing through Mercer's journals. They wanted to know about the others, about the knife-through-moon sign found in more than one state. Hart gave them the official line, "We deal with what's here. Mercer is here. That's the fight we finished." But when he sat alone on the late train back, he admitted to himself he wasn't sure. Life in Strasburg edged toward normal, though carefully, like a town learning to walk again after a fall. That December, the school held its Christmas market on Main Street, the first community event since the arrest. Parents browsed handmade wreaths and jars of jam. Children tugged mittens and sipped cocoa, but many eyes still darted toward the tree line when the wind rattled too hard. In the church gym, the Christmas pageant went on, voices of children rising in carols that cracked but did not falter. Maya Brooks sat in the front row, her notebook open not for an article but for her own reckoning. She had begun outlining a book not about Mercer, but about Strasburg. "If I only write the monster," she told Sarah over coffee one snowy afternoon, "then he wins. If I write the valley, the people who stayed, the people who refused to bow, then we take it back." Sarah nodded, her coat draped over the chair. "Just don't polish it. Fear was real. People need to see that too." Earl Whitaker reclaimed the ridges in his own way. The old farmer, with a thermos tucked in his coat, began hiking the trails again, hammering bright wooden markers into the trees. "The woods belong to us, not him," he told a young deputy who offered to accompany him. Neighbors began to notice the painted stakes and took comfort, as though each marker pushed Mercer further out of memory. Still, the whispers did not vanish. At the diner, truckers spoke of missing farmhands, 2 counties over, barns marked with strange etchings. Some dismissed them as stories stretched thin by fear. Others looked at Hart, waiting for him to say if Mercer was truly alone. He never gave them certainty, only steadiness. On Christmas Eve, the bell rang across the snowbound valley, candles glowing in the church pews. The Carter family sat in the front, still hollowed by grief, but held upright by neighbors pressing close. Hart stood at the back with Sarah, listening as hymns filled the rafters. For a rare moment, the heaviness lifted, and Strasburg felt like itself again. After the service, Maya stepped into the snow, the cold air sharp in her lungs. She looked down at the valley lights and scribbled a line across her notebook. "Fear is what hunts us. Choice is what saves us." Later, it would close her book, but that night, it was simply a promise whispered into the winter air. Slowly, the season passed. Children sledded down hills, porch steps lit with strings of colored bulbs, neighbors lingering longer in conversation. Strasburg did not forget the scars remained, and the name Mercer would never vanish, but it remembered more than fear. It remembered who kept watch, who returned, who faced the dark and stayed. And though March and the trial loomed, the valley was no longer defined by what haunted it. It was defined by the choice to endure. March 2024 arrived with the thaw of winter, but Strasburg still carried the weight of Mercer's shadow as his trial began inside the crowded courthouse. Reporters packed the benches, cameras clicking with every creak of the oak doors. Families of the victims filled the front rows, the Carter family among them, their grief unsoftened yet steadied by the arms of neighbors at their sides. Captain Hart sat at the prosecution's table in full uniform. Lieutenant Sarah Monroe beside him, her notes stacked neatly. Evidence sharpened into a blade the jury could not turn away from. When Mercer entered, shackled, thinner, his face carried the same unnerving calm. He glanced at the jury and smiled faintly before the judge's gavel brought silence. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. Mercer's journals, the jars of preserved remains, the recurring knife-through-moon symbol traced across barns from Virginia to Kentucky. Forensic experts tied his handwriting to lists of the missing. Maps of multiple states unfurled, painting Mercer not as a lone aberration, but as a predator who traveled with ritual. Sarah testified, her voice steady, describing Devil's Hollow. She spoke not only of Mercer lunging at Maya, but of the mark carved into the ancient oak that matched those found miles away. It wasn't random, she told the jury. It was deliberate, a system he built to frighten and to kill. Maya Brooks took the stand, her notebook in her hands. She described the package Mercer had sent, the circled clipping, the night she stood in the clearing with him closing in. "He wanted me silent," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath. "I chose to speak. That's why I'm here today." The defense leaned on mental illness, portraying Mercer as unfit, broken by childhood. But when Mercer was allowed to speak, he shattered their strategy. Leaning toward the microphone, his eyes blazing, he said, "You can chain me, but the altar still stands. It doesn't need me to finish." Gasps broke through the room. The judge struck his gavel hard. For the jury, it was no longer a question of madness, it was menace. Outside, crowds gathered daily. Instead of candles alone, they tied strips of white cloth along the courthouse fence, each marked with the name of someone lost. Wind tugged at them so they fluttered like a field of ghosts. Pastor Bennett stood with the families, reading aloud the names one by one, his voice steady in the spring air. Even Earl Whitaker came down from his farm, his old hands fastening one last strip to the fence, holding it in place as though anchoring the whole town. After days of testimony, closing arguments sharpened the line. The prosecution called Mercer not insane but deliberately a man who built rituals to prey on fear. The defense faltered, weakened by Mercer's own words. The jury deliberated less than a day. When they returned, the room seemed to still. "Guilty," the foreman announced on all counts: kidnapping, murder, attempted murder, desecration. The sentence: life without parole. Mercer did not flinch. He laughed, low and jagged, until deputies pressed him back into his seat. Even in chains, he tried to own the final word. But outside, when the verdict reached the fence line, the crowd's reaction broke like a wave. Neighbors embraced, tears falling as the white strips snapped and danced in the wind. Maya stood with her notebook pressed to her chest, writing a single word across the page: verdict. On the courthouse steps, Hart exhaled, shoulders heavy but eased. He reached into his pocket and touched the badge he carried there, squeezing it hard before slipping it back. It was not triumph, but it was release. For the first time in months, the valley had heard the word it needed most: guilty. Spring returned to Strasburg with cautious brightness, the kind that painted dogwoods white across the hillsides, but did not erase the shadows still tucked in memory. The trial was over, the verdict read. Mercer locked in a cell far from the valley, yet his echo lingered in the way people paused when the woods grew too quiet. Healing came in slow steps, not in triumph but in ordinary acts of living. The school hosted its spring fair, but this year every booth from jars of honey to hand-stitched quilts was tied to a fundraiser for families who had lost someone. Neighbors bought more than they needed, not out of pity but to prove that grief did not isolate. It bound. Children darted between stalls, laughter freer now, while parents kept a watchful but less fearful eye. Earl Whitaker turned his fields green again, leaning on his plow as he told passers-by that soil had to remember life after fear. At the church, Pastor Bennett spoke less of shadows and more of light, ringing the new bell rope at dawn not only for worship but as a reminder that the valley had endured. Captain Hart struggled with the quiet, but instead of solitary walks, he chose presence. At the Memorial Day gathering, when flags waved and veterans saluted, Hart stood with neighbors, accepting their handshakes, feeling at last that he belonged to the valley he had fought to hold together. Later that summer, he attended Earl's granddaughter's wedding atop the ridge. Beneath wide skies and wildflowers in jars, vows were spoken, and Hart surprised himself by joining the dance afterward, moving slowly with a widow from town who smiled for the first time in months. Sarah Monroe buried herself in work, scanning cold cases across counties for Mercer's mark. Some she dismissed, some she flagged, but she always came back to Strasburg, knowing her watch was far from over. "Healing isn't about forgetting," she told Hart one evening. "It's about living alongside the fear without bowing to it." Maya Brooks finished her manuscript by late summer, her pages filled not with Mercer's rituals but with Strasburg's endurance, the Carter family's strength, Earl's markers on the trails, the fundraiser fair, the wedding laughter. She closed with a line she underlined twice. "The hollow scarred us, but scars are proof of healing, not of defeat." When she sealed the manuscript and placed the broken mask in a locked trunk, her hands trembled with relief. A permanent marker of remembrance was raised at Devil's Hollow, a small stone, engraved with the names of those lost. Families gathered quietly at its unveiling, touching the carved letters with reverent hands. It stood not as a shrine to Mercer, but as a vow that his shadow would not own the valley again. In August, Hart stood on the ridge, looking over golden fields as sunset brushed them with fire. He did not listen for footsteps anymore. He heard only crickets and the murmur of people living below. The valley was not whole, but it was alive, and for the first time Hart allowed himself to believe that was enough. Autumn came again to Strasburg, softer this time, the leaves turning gold not with dread but with the rhythm of a valley remembering itself. A year had passed since the morning when horror first split open their quiet, and though scars remained, life had threaded itself back through every street, field, and home. The monument at Devil's Hollow stood weathered already, its stone warm beneath the hands of those who touched it, not to grieve alone but to honor together. Captain Hart visited one evening, the air crisp, the sky burnished orange. He traced the carved names, then paused as the distant bell from Pastor Bennett's church rang across the valley, steady and sure. For the first time, the sound did not call him to vigilance but to peace. Sarah joined him, setting a single candle at the base of the stone. "We don't erase scars, Hart," she said softly. "We learn to walk with them." Hart nodded, understanding that the valley had chosen not to carry Mercer's darkness, but the resilience that had risen against it. In town, Maya Brooks' book had been read and passed from hand to hand, each reader leaving a note of thanks tucked between its pages before returning it to her doorstep. Earl Whitaker's fields swayed tall, and children's voices echoed from the schoolyard without hesitation. Life had not forgotten fear, but it had outlived it. One afternoon, a young boy stood at the monument with his mother, running his fingers across the stone. "Who were they?" he asked. His mother knelt beside him, eyes wet but steady. "They were the reason you can play in these fields, safe and free," she said. The boy nodded, small but certain, and in that moment the story of Strasburg passed to another generation. As the sun dipped low, Hart looked down from the ridge, seeing windows glow warm, smoke rise from chimneys, the valley breathing steady. The hollow had once meant terror, but now it meant something different, a place where shadows were met and broken, a place where courage endured. The valley was not whole, but it was alive. And in that truth, Hart finally found enough.